Hi, everyone. That was a quick 3-minute break. We want to welcome you back to our final session as a part of day 2 of our Emerging Trends Symposium. Before we get to our presenters, we did just want to throw up another Mentimeter question to kind of get your perspective on their topic. So, what new or novel drug are you hearing most about in your community? If you have closed your browser and you are in need to get back in, it is menti.com and then use a code 69764327. Going to give everybody a second to get back in. We've got Midazines, Kratom. Thank you, Brittany, for putting that back in the chat if you closed your browser. Lots of fentanyl, xylazine, 7-OH. Looks like I'm going to learn something today because I don't know what that is. Polymixes. All right. Well, we are really excited today to be joined by Dr. Green. Dr. Green is an epidemiologist specializing in drug use, opioid use disorder, and drug-related injury. She holds degrees in epidemiology and biostatistics from McGill University and a PhD in epidemiology from Yale. At Brandeis University, she is a professor and director of the Opioid Policy Research Collaborative, leading studies on the drug supply, overdose prevention, and policy impacts. She also co-directs the COBRA on opioids and overdose at Rhode Island Hospital and serves as an adjunct professor at Brown University. We're also joined by Dr. Alex Krotulski. He is a director of the toxology and chemistry at the Center for Forensic Science, Research and Education, and a program manager for NPS Discovery, the center's open access drug early warning system. A chemist and forensic toxicologist with 10 years of experience, he also serves as a program director for forensic toxicology at Thomas Jefferson University and senior associate editor of the Journal of Analytic Toxology. He holds a PhD in chemistry from Temple University, an MS in forensic science from Arcadia University, and a BS in chemistry from Loyola University in New Orleans. Thank you both doctors for being here. I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Traci Green.
Thank you so much, Zoe. It's great to see you all. I'm just going to share my slides from here. I'm really glad to have a chance to talk with you, and it looks like you all are navigating quite a lot of changes in the drug supply. So I'm going to highlight a couple of those, speaking about New England in particular, and then and also emphasize some of those considerations for action that might be helpful for public safety and certainly for your community. But just to center us, as I mentioned, I'm at the OPRC, or the Opioid Policy Research Collaborative at Brandeis. Just a slide to share with you some direction if you want to go check out some of the things we've been up to. But more, I wanted to ground us in what really is this terminology of drug checking. It's different from drug surveillance or drug monitoring. Drug checking, it directly informs individuals who are using drugs what could be in their drugs. And this approach has existed far before the 70s, and certainly even maybe from the first time humans were taking bark or plant or any other material to know, informing by touch or taste or smell. But using devices like those on the right-hand side, we have a number of testing tools that have developed. And models for drug checking include community-based, they can be lab-based, and mobile. In Massachusetts and a couple other states, we've been organizing around what we call Street Check. And this is a drug checking platform, if you will, to help share results, as well as to organize and standardize the process of collecting donor samples, testing them in the community, and then sharing back results, especially results that have additional laboratory testing like you'll hear from Alex. So this website also aggregates trends, and I'm going to speak to a number of those from our data. But first, just to also level set, we test specifically samples of donated remnant samples that include powder or crystal or rock, pills or capsules, but also remnant materials like containers and used baggies and cookers and cottons. We do not test any biological samples or anything with visible blood, and that includes syringes because they often are reused multiple times and don't necessarily reflect both what the person last took as well as what's circulating in the community. So it can be very confusing, not to mention the biohazard risk. Usually a very small amount is what's helpful for testing, both for the lab and for the community. So this is about a grain of rice. That process of drug checking, what that looks like, allows for a community partner to engage with a client where a sample is collected. Then we test on site with an FTIR or a Fourier transform infrared spectrometer, the visualization in the middle there. And then we also use test strips, which maybe you're more familiar with: xylazine test strips, fentanyl test strips, benzo test strips, medetomidine test strips, nitazene test strips, pretty much anything that is available that is shown to be valid that could give us a quick turnaround of information while the person is in front of us, because that's the most important time to deliver initial results, counseling and safety planning. And then a portion of those results, or all of the data, the sample goes to the laboratory for testing, and it gets additional, more discriminant results, and that allows us in a couple weeks' time to get more information back, additional counseling and additional safety planning. So that's sort of what a drug checking process looks like. In a drug surveillance or a monitoring process, you may have only laboratory testing and it never goes to the human or the community. It may only go to the health department or the law enforcement department or so forth. So what are some of the data trends we've been seeing? I selected a few here, and with the Northeast in mind. Alex will share a little bit more about national side, but so this is a depiction of some of the cocaine in transition, if you will, that we've been seeing in New England. And in particular, we're one of large consumption-based stimulants in New England are consumed heavily, and we do see that the stimulant, aside from caffeine, that is the illicit substance that we're looking at is cocaine. It's really dominant in New England area, though methamphetamine has been rising. And so this, I just did a quick visualization of the active cuts that we see in cocaine. And the worldwide record-breaking production of cocaine is very much true in our communities, where we see that purity is very high. We see very few cuts. If you will, the pie is very small with, there's not a lot of color there to indicate and suggest that there aren't a lot of active cuts. And we triangulate that information with emergency department visits in our region, where we see that stimulant event emergency departments are on the rise. So this is something we're tracking as an emerging trend. A number of you had mentioned about xylazine and medetomidine, and these are two mouthfuls. I had to practice a lot, many years to get to medetomidine, but in this case, both of these substances are veterinary medications. They're a class called alpha-2 agonists, and you may be seeing them or hearing about them because they have a lot of challenges associated with them on the health side. They have a lot of similarities. They have rapid onset. They certainly cause prolonged sedation. I wouldn't say always, but nearly always they're found with fentanyl, so they coexist in an environment that is already potentially causing overdose. And so we have seen some cases of involvement in fatal overdose, but they do cause withdrawal. And these are not federally scheduled. They have unique differences. Medetomidine is more potent than xylazine, 200 or 300 times more so. So smaller amounts can have profound effect, especially longer sedation. And other health considerations around hallucinations and other withdrawal symptoms, as well as pronounced lower heart rate. So this is sort of medetomidine has a different constellation of health effects that may present very much like sedation, but then there's more. Xylazine, in addition to sedation, has very clear association with wounds, and these are I did not include those as visualizations because I think you can find many instances of those. But PAARI has a wonderful project that we had the pleasure of collaborating with them on for xylazine prevention and interactive tools. So check out that website. But in these instances, xylazine and medetomidine in the fentanyl supply can actually alter fentanyl purity and affect potency. And what that looks like in terms of trends, these visualizations are for Massachusetts, and they show the presence of xylazine and medetomidine in the drug samples that we've been testing in MADS, or the Massachusetts Drug Supply Data Stream, our drug checking program. And prior to Q2 of 2024, you can see on the top that the orange line and the dark blue line didn't really exist. Medetomidine was not detected in any drugs that we'd been testing for meds. And since we've been doing this since 2020, we were fairly sure that that was what was more true than not. And the xylazine, the reduction in xylazine that we're seeing in the light blue line, as you see over time, reflects that with the rise of medetomidine in the samples of fentanyl, that things are changing. And that's important because xylazine and its association with wounds, unfortunately, it's not necessarily connected to the dose of xylazine so far as we can see, but just presence of xylazine. But xylazine shifting, in addition to less xylazine in the drug supply, we're actually seeing the amount of xylazine also shifting. So this is an image of the ratios of xylazine and fentanyl, so substances that have both, and that's most of our samples. And this just reflects whether there was more xylazine to fentanyl, that's the red bars, or more fentanyl to xylazine, or approximately similar. And that shift over time really shows us that the amount of xylazine we're seeing has been decreasing. And the potentially avoidance tactics, even at the supply chain level, are clear. On the bottom right here, you can see I circled it with my purple pen here, but not just less than a month ago in Lawrence, Massachusetts, with a large seizure of pressed pills, methamphetamine, as well as M30 pressed pills, the presence of xylazine test strips in the middle of this figure, indicating that xylazine is something that people want to find even at the supply chain level, and with an eye towards looking to avoid it because of the lack of, or the concerns around wounds in the supply. Nitazines, I don't think I saw anybody necessarily talking about nitazines, but it's important to think about nitazines as a synthetic opioid that can be weaker, similar strength, or stronger than fentanyl. And nitazines as a sort of family, if you will, we do still see them oftentimes alongside opioids or fentanyl and mixed in. But the figure that you can see on the top does suggest that maybe we've seen a bit of a bump up, and then more recently a trend downwards. It's really hard to know, to be honest. And I think that it's one of the reasons why we wanted to share about it, and why we, on the right-hand side, last summer had presented a bulletin, or an informational bulletin, to get people to know about what nitazines are and their trends. There are many different kinds of nitazines, and because of that, it's important to know what is circulating in the community and the particular qualities of that nitazine. I think for those who follow policy, the HALT Act, which changed federal law, that changed in July of 2025, it expanded fentanyl-related substances into Schedule 1, and also instituted minimum sentencing for fentanyl trafficking. So while nitazines were not included in that, so it's possible we may see nitazines as people shift away from fentanyl into other things. It's hard to know, but it's important to know about them. And then a trend also that we've been seeing are shifts in heroin, which has never actually left. We've seen varying quantities of heroin, very typically at low purity, and many of those samples have extraction components that suggest that there are different ways that heroin is being extracted. Back in 19th century, when heroin was first extracted, we would, people used various approaches. And when Bayer first came up with extraction that resulted in heroin as we know it today. So while many of the samples that we see have very small amount of the drug, we are seeing an increase and a strong geographic component to especially areas that have had historic heroin/fentanyl combinations, but seeing more heroin in the supply. And that's actually East and West Coast, but I'm focusing now on the East Coast. So I also wanted to make sure that people knew about carfentanil, which has had a bit of a long history in our community. I think, unlike past cases in Ohio or Florida, where carfentanil was a bit of a boogeyman, and really found in high concentrations and in many samples, and linked to massive numbers of overdose fatalities, the kind of and form of carfentanil that we are seeing currently is in very low levels, and with Alex's team, and otherwise that means that really highly discriminant testing, otherwise QTOF and other laboratory levels in the past 12 months to see very trace levels, although that has been creeping up. And I think with that in mind, we did do a deep dive into a death record review process with our partners at the health department, and with their helpful data from what's called Suitors, which is a CDC-funded initiative. We could review cases that had carfentanil involved in the decedent's demise. And we could see that in those instances, while there were few, certainly not in the order of magnitude that, again, we'd seen in the past, but that it is meaningful still to track carfentanil, especially for people who might be at risk. People who don't have opioid tolerance, like people using stimulants, or who may be more at risk for volatile drug supply changes, like people experiencing homelessness. But the big take home here is that fentanyl is in massive transition. And this is a figure that shows the active cuts, or in other words, what is added to a drug. And I showed you before the cocaine, those pie figures which had very small slits. In this case with fentanyl, it is absolutely lit up with color. We have tons of active cuts in the drug supply, and that has changed over time dramatically. In 2022 at the bottom and moving up to 2025, which we're of course still in the middle of, up at the top, but the proportion of the light blue, this no active cuts, has really decreased over time. And that's because it's been expanded greatly by many, many combinations of active cuts. That is complexity that we've just been talking about, medetomidine, xylazine, and other additives that have profound effects. And that means that there are fewer and fewer fentanyl. What is fentanyl is now a compilation of many, many things that people are trying to manage in their bodies and in the community, and that you're interacting with in your public safety work. So we talked a lot about fentanyl and changing, but what about fentanyl potency? So medical grade fentanyl that we would have in a surgical procedure is not illicitly manufactured fentanyl potency. And fentanyl really the synthesis procedures change. So they change with policy and interdiction and knowledge transfer and so forth. And that means that drug purity and potency differ by that knowledge transfer, by geography, by time. And so while we see that the lab results, like how much percent weight fentanyl can reflect both of those things, and they have been changing with respect to the East and the West Coast. The fentanyl composition, the percentage of fentanyl in a given drug known as fentanyl, has been dropping. And the picture above really reflects that. And Alex has some other data to share on that too. But this is very geographically important because the Western states, if you are represented on here, are seeing a different story perhaps than our Eastern states, where the fentanyl composition has been decreasing for some time, where we've actually born earlier starts with fentanyl, and that has important implications. So we need research, and this isn't just me saying as a researcher we need research, but we really do need research on the drug supply to understand and better sampling to understand what these shifts are and how to respond to them. I want to think about time here, but I want to take a quick opportunity, because of these changes in potency, purity, and supply composition have really, really important changes to humans who are using them, and the communities that are attending, as well as to public safety. And the first and foremost important one to know about and think about is opioid withdrawal. Certainly use will change, but opioid withdrawal, which occurs when someone who's dependent on opioids because they've been using them regularly and it has abruptly decreased, or they halt their use, and it results in symptoms that are characterized as very painful: bone pain, vomiting, muscle aches, similar to the nausea and worse flu you've ever experienced, times 100, is how it's been described to me. And this can happen by choice. People cold turkey, they're stopping and they experience this through jailing or removal in the community, through hospitalization. And also we can precipitate it or start it off or kick it off by administering a lot of naloxone. So there are some ways that are importantly health effects that have profound effect. And why is this important? Because it turns out that withdrawal that's related to fentanyl is more severe and has more sustained symptoms compared to withdrawal from non-fentanyl opioids. And we're just starting to scratch the surface on nitazenes, which are stronger and longer, and they have different aspects of opioid withdrawal symptoms that are a little bit more prickly. But withdrawal is a barrier to overdose prevention and to preventive behaviors like testing for potency to avoid risks. So the kind of things that we know that people want to do to stay alive and stay safe, they're less able to navigate when they're overwhelmed with withdrawal. That makes sense. If you don't feel well, you're going to attend to how you feel, not thinking about, are you crossing your I's and dotting your T's? Crossing your T's, dotting your I's. But in this case, what we're seeing is that people experiencing withdrawal symptoms may be at higher risk of both drug-related death and non-fatal overdose. And that's because this precipitates or brings on a quicker return to use, a faster use, and incentivizes using alone in isolation. And that's when death occurs. So this really great piece by Yi and colleagues followed almost 700 people, and even they were people who were using small doses first and going slow to start safe and using fentanyl test strips. Even when they always or often did these things, 2/3 of them still indicated that they sometimes, when they feel sick or have withdrawal from not having their drug, they don't think about overdose prevention because the thing they're thinking about is staying not sick. So supply changes, like we're having less and less fentanyl, weird variable fentanyl, results in withdrawal that is worse for the human and behavior that and hurt that causes overdose prevention risk, and it really can only be alleviated by opioid use or treatment or both. But the other change really for humans is that you should be aware of with the changes in the drug supply are overdose and response. And the real emphasis on, and we've had more sedation emerge, is the need for monitoring and breathing supports, certainly naloxone, but not over administration of naloxone, because once you have some level of breathing return, that even shallow breathing, additional naloxone is not indicated. But if there is no return to respiration, of course, nasal naloxone is, even after giving nasal naloxone, that this is a medical emergency that needs swift and specialized attention. But this rise of sedation means that we can expect that there may be longer non-responsiveness. Even in our data and research collecting interviews with people who are using drugs and experiencing metatominine and xylazine, they may even be cognizant and aware, but appearing sedated and unable to move or respond. So they may even be able to hear, but not able to move. This results in a huge risk of assault and injury. When the weather comes, it's hypothermia or hyperthermia and sun exposure. So the real impetus for safe monitoring and protection from the elements, and then collaborating with community partners and organizations to establish those protocols, those best practices to address the rising sedation in our drug supply is part of community caretaking and keeping people safe. Other health concerns, I won't go too deeply into the wounds that from xylazine, but the other skin and soft tissue infections from unhygienic injection or moving too quickly because they don't feel well. And then we've talked a little bit about stimulants like cocaine, but methamphetamine. These have really heavy effects on the heart, and the additives in the drug supply can exacerbate that further. So risks of heart attacks and seizures or other heart problems, as well as loading on other parts of the body, the liver and kidney, from additives that have been increased in the drug supply, mean that we need to support sterile syringe access, wound care, and basic health access. So for response and what you should really need to know, the other key thing that we've been learning about that, and these are data from really helpful research from Joanne Neal and colleagues in both New York and in other places that have been really focused on post-overdose, or what's happening when you administer naloxone. And I thought this was really helpful for public safety to extract this and share it, because we're talking about withdrawal and too much naloxone, and what we can expect. So in an overdose, many people have talked about how angry people get, and patients and people who use drugs talk about their withdrawal post naloxone administration. And it turns out from this research that there are two different phenomena. And you can work to address both. You can reduce withdrawal for the person by not administering too much naloxone. And in their data from a randomized controlled trial and otherwise found that more than 2 or more doses was more likely associated with the person experiencing withdrawal. So a lot of naloxone. But you can also reduce anger from an angry interaction by, turns out, communicating positively with the person who's overdosed, by talking to them and explaining what happened, or trying to calm them down in a de-escalation. And actually, the opposite was also true when they found that communications were negative, especially for that person who had overdosed, experiencing criticizing, berating, or chastising, that it was more strongly associated with an angered interaction. And so these are sort of take-home piece of practical overdose response that I wanted to reflect back, which is administer naloxone if it's suspected, summon the medical support, but the readministration of naloxone may not be indicated if you see that you get oxygen. If there isn't, you have to make sure that you have oxygen supports that are available to until medical support arrives. But that communication calmly, factually, and positively to the victim will ensure that when they are revived, that the interaction is a neutral to positive. Last thing that I really wanted to share to make sure that you know about is that in this environment of withdrawal and volatile use, that supporting treatment for opioid use disorder withdrawal that is local, accessible, and affordable, and knowing where people can get it and who can partner within your community for warm handoffs and linkage to care, so that when people want it, they're ready to start. They have access to things like methadone, buprenorphine, and if you haven't seen or heard about it, there are a number of long-acting injectables. 1 week or 1 month of buprenorphine. Are available. They work. Patients do well on them. These are available in a number of different locations, but it's very local. So it's worthwhile to find out, including in Maryland in supermarket pharmacies, which was mind-blowing and phenomenally good. The last thing I wanted to just leave you all with is just to think about the role of police action in the environment. When interacting with many people with opioid dependence, that a supply interruption has the effect of introducing an inconsistency in the supply, and that changes the certainty that people have and the sources that they can use to verify or to connect with and understand and protect themselves with the overdose prevention behaviors. That results in withdrawal, and it changes, as I'm sort of sharing about, an overdose risk, whether that is a non-fatal or a fatal, but there's a hazardous environment that can be mitigated by really acting and thinking about, I know Sarki spoke to some of this as well, but really, if that is a safer supply approach, in some places like Rhode Island and New York and other places, overdose prevention centers are an idea. But other work that I've shared today with drug checking to allow people to shift and know about the changes that have occurred from a drug seizure in their community, equipping the community with naloxone education and other things that they can protect themselves with, like wound kits and test strips, and then making the treatment access very open. Allows for, if people return to use or if they continue using a supply that has been massively disrupted from a drug seizure, that they're likely to survive that in a way that they can stay safe. So those last couple points for you all. So the drug supply is in flux. It's very important to learn about the local challenges and changes, and help thinking about community drug checking as one way to learn about this. Some of the tools you already have, naloxone, connecting with treatment providers, may already be in hand, and it's just putting a different emphasis on the different syllable. You're going to work to make people have a different kind of tool and helping them in a different way. But people are using drugs and they suffer massive inconsistencies and the volatility, and that is a lot of risk. And I've tried to share with you some of those, but they can be mitigated, including by police actions that may even unintentionally introduce harm, by really thinking about the public health and public safety goals, thinking about the evidence base, that some of which I've shared today, hopefully, and thinking about those short and longer term strategies. So thanks so much, and I will hand it over to Alex.
Thanks, Tracy. So I'm going to spend the next, hopefully only 10 minutes or so talking about some drug trends and regional differences, and then definitely want to get to enough time for us to have a discussion or answer any questions at the end. So I just wanted to start off by talking about our organization very quickly. I work for a nonprofit forensic laboratory called the Center for Forensic Science Research and Education. I threw this picture in here of our lab just as a reminder for me to sort of explain that. Our laboratory, our mission is to provide accurate and sensitive analytical testing in the laboratory, testing for a variety of drugs and adulterants. As Traci mentioned, we work with Traci's team on analyzing samples from a variety of different places. And we also work with a number of health departments in cities like New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago, and other places out west, looking at what the drug supplies look like in different areas. So some of the trends that I'll talk about will be more higher level trends, sort of in aggregate across the country, but then I'll get into some more nuances. Our laboratory does perform both qualitative and quantitative testing, so I'll talk a little bit about those quantitative results at the end of this. And yeah, I think that was all I wanted to mention. So this is data just showing the number of samples really that we've run over the years. You can see on the left, you can see we've had this sort of explosion in the positivity of fentanyl. It doesn't mean that there's more fentanyl out there. That just means that a lot more people are interested in laboratory-based drug checking, and we've been doing a lot of testing. So that's really more indicative there. You'll notice then on the right, as Traci mentioned, heroin has never really gone away. We've always still seen heroin, just to a lesser extent than fentanyl. And then in the middle, you have your stimulants, methamphetamine and cocaine. I think the right side of this graphic probably does a better job of illustrating what we want to get at in terms of how much methamphetamine and cocaine we test. Again, on the right, you can see that fentanyl remains sort of in terms of positivity of samples, the substance that we detect most, followed by cocaine. And then you can see methamphetamine down here at the bottom. Traci can comment to this more, but our laboratory really doesn't receive a lot of methamphetamine in large part because there's probably the least concern with methamphetamine versus other drug supplies. So that's why we don't receive as much, although we do receive some for testing. And methamphetamine is probably the only example where we actually see drug products that don't contain a lot of adulterants, as Traci has already alluded to. And again, fentanyl, as Traci alluded to, is where we really see a lot of our adulteration and substitution and a lot of these new drugs emerging. So I'm going to talk really briefly just about trends in adulterants, then I'm going to get into these different adulterants together. So here on the left are your local anesthetics, things like lidocaine, protein, and tetracaine. Some of you may recall back in 2021, especially here in the Philadelphia area and what I guess we would call sort of the Mid-Atlantic region, we were seeing actually at that time high amounts or high incidence of xylazine in the fentanyl supply. It was a time when we were seeing also tramadol mixed in, and there were these products called Rizzi. So lidocaine is not something that's new to us within the fentanyl supply, but the other local anesthetics really are. And you can see in the last sort of year and a half, we've seen just this continued increase in positivity of these local anesthetics. Interestingly, I'll show some data on these in a little bit. More detail, but interestingly, we have seen kind of different trends in some of these. We're actually seeing a little bit less lidocaine right now than we are procaine and tetracaine, so it's kind of been interesting to track. So at least data like immediately of what we're looking at the moment. In the middle here, we've got things like caffeine and diphenhydramine. We see caffeine, caffeine and diphenhydramine have a bit of sort of regional notes to them. I'll actually talk about those a little bit later. And I'm going to talk more about BTMPS, but BTMPS has been sort of one of these substances that has boggled a lot of our minds. It's appeared as an adulterant really alongside fentanyl. It is a light stabilizer. It's used in industry for coating plastics, and it was at the time quite alarming or quite surprising that it emerged in the drug supply. Although I think many of us have still kind of been confused about its presence. I'll talk about a little bit about it more later, but you can see we have had sort of this large uptick of BTMPS. We have had some fall off since. And then on the right is your local anesthetic. So this is, again, aggregate data for us across the country. We have now seen this sort of shift between Q1 and Q2 of seeing more medetomidine than xylazine. The data here in 2021, a lot of the samples in 2021 were coming from our Philadelphia collaborator, so it's no surprise that the majority of fentanyl we were seeing contained xylazine. But you can see over time that has fallen off, and we now see more medetomidine than we do xylazine within the drug samples that we test. There are a variety of different good resources out there now related to sort of what this shift has meant from xylazine to medetomidine. Many of you will know that previously with xylazine, we were concerned about the soft tissue and infections and wounds associated with xylazine, and now we're more concerned with the bradycardia and the ICU admissions that result from medetomidine, either from the bradycardia or from the withdrawal that's associated, the more extreme withdrawal, which is associated with its use. The one thing I just wanted to note, so Traci already covered that now we are seeing pretty small amounts of xylazine. This is data that comes from our collaborators in Philadelphia, and it just kind of shows these inflection points within the drug supply. So back in 2024, you can see almost all of the fentanyl in Philadelphia contains xylazine. As we moved on, medetomidine emerged in May actually of 2024. We started seeing sort of the shift of medetomidine being more commonly associated with fentanyl samples and xylazine falling off. But what this graphic on the left doesn't show is really, I think, the big picture behind xylazine and medetomidine, and that's what's on the right. In the days and sort of the ending time of xylazine in Philadelphia, we were seeing, and this is our quantitative data. So this is the amount of xylazine per product. You can see in this sort of Q4 2023 into Q1 2024, you can see that over half, and this is on average, over half of the sample was xylazine. That's an extremely large amount of xylazine that was being cut into fentanyl here in Philadelphia. You can see that that's since fallen off, and while we do still see xylazine, we see xylazine at pretty small amounts. The good news about at least medetomidine is that we're not seeing half of the fentanyl product be medetomidine, which is good. Our medetomidine quantitative data is really probably around more 10 to 20%, which is, I say it's good because, as Traci mentioned, medetomidine is significantly more potent than xylazine. If we had products that had 50% medetomidine, I think we'd have even worse of a problem than we currently do. And dealing with the ramifications of medetomidine as an adulterant has already been challenging on our public health colleagues and healthcare systems. So shifting to local anesthetics, again, this is kind of where the data, and again, all of our data for Q3 has a star on it because it will be finalized here in the next couple of weeks, but it's not yet finalized. Again, this is kind of just showing that increase in local anesthetics. And again, at this time, while it doesn't get showed in the aggregate for Q3, it does appear we're seeing more tetracaine at the moment and procaine than lidocaine. And one other thing I just wanted to call out with the local anesthetics, one thing that that has been sort of a big question for us is, well, how concerning are the local anesthetics? And the question is, I don't think we really know. I think the impacts of additions of potent opioids like carfentanil and the nitazines to the fentanyl supply, or the addition of xylazine and medetomidine, I think is a bit more clear than some of these other adulterants. I went back and looked at our quantitative data. On average, the amount of lidocaine that we see in products is about 15%, although we have seen up to 70%. I imagine a sample that has 70% xylazine, or sorry, excuse me, 70% lidocaine, depending on how many bags, at least here in Philadelphia, folks use glassine bags. So if you're using multiple bags, especially many bags a day, that amount of lidocaine probably does get to the point where it's significant. Although, again, it's been kind of hard to track some of this as we've got all these different adulterants emerging at the same time, and we've been dealing with the sort of the ramifications of medetomidine. And then BTMPS, again, this is the graphic for BTMPS. There's just a couple of things I wanted to mention in addition to what I've already mentioned about BTMPS. I think BTMPS was a quite interesting, not wake-up call, but a a good sort of red flag for us in the drug checking space, in that we were able to come together and work pretty collaboratively, pretty quickly. So BTMPS is, from my recollection, I don't know if Traci can think of anything else, but BTMPS pretty much emerged overnight from coast to coast. This graphic down here is from NIFLS, so it's the crime laboratory data that gets consolidated into DEA's NIFLS system, and you can see there's only one state on there that hasn't detected BTMPS, at least at the time I pulled this, and that was Wyoming. This was really an adulterant that appeared coast to coast overnight, very quickly, and to be able to come together and gather information on it, we were first hearing about BTMPS from Oregon, then from folks in North Carolina, and we were seeing it at the same time in Philadelphia. So coming together to be able to just figure out what this was, confirm it, get resources for the drug checking groups in the field that are using the FTIRs, and then just trying to get as much information as we could on BTMPS, I think is just it's kind of a, it's a maybe a success story, but maybe just kind of one of those positive things you look at backwards. Well, I still don't think we really understand what the impacts on humans are of BTMPS. There's different studies out there, although I don't think that they shed much light on what it truly, what the true impact and significance is. The report on the right was a report we released earlier this year related to BTMPS and being used to try to make fentanyl, although we've learned through this process that it's really not successful. It was kind of one of these really weird theories early on that turned out to be, unfortunately, true, I guess. You can see BTMPS. Here's the structure of BTMPS. It has this pyridine ring, so this ring containing a nitrogen. If you took off these methyl groups, so these little sticks hanging off, that would be a common sort of core to fentanyl. And it turns out that you actually can take BTMPS to a not so great process and make some of the precursors to fentanyl and eventually make, well, sorry, some of the precursors to tetramethylfentanyl and then eventually make tetramethylfentanyl. Again, this is these little sticks here, these methyl groups on the edges. If you took those off, this would be fentanyl. But again, this is a really hard process. It's not working well. And I think this is just an example of a failed experiment of somebody saying, well, could we do this with BTMPS and it not working out? And I do think that's probably the reason we've seen some fall off in BTMPS. I mean, there's other theories as well out there as to why BTMPS exists, but certainly this endeavor of trying to make a fentanyl-like drug from BTMPS has really turned into a failed experiment. So just to talk a little bit about some co-detections of drugs. So I've talked just about drugs individually, and now this is a slide on the co-detection of drugs. Again, this is data that's an aggregate. It's a very busy slide, so I understand that. I just want to really point out two things. When you look at fentanyl on the left, you can see when you go across fentanyl, 73% of fentanyl samples have 4-AMPP, 25% had BTMPS. Again, this is on the left is in Q2 2025. 34% contain caffeine, and so on. Across over 44% contain lidocaine. And then again, you can follow fentanyl again here on the right for Q3. And you can see that fentanyl often has a lot of these other things in it. But the other drugs that we test really don't. If you look at methamphetamine, very low occurrence of other substances, as well as ketamine, very low occurrence of other substances alongside ketamine. Cocaine does have its adulterants. Certainly, we see lidocaine from time to time. We see some other local anesthetics. There are samples where we've detected fentanyl alongside cocaine, specifically in coke samples, but certainly not the norm of those samples. So, and you can see some of these, some of this data is skewed by the end. So over here, ketamine 5. There was one ketamine sample that also contained fentanyl and 4-AMPP and caffeine and lidocaine. So that's why these numbers look high. But for the most part, as Traci mentioned, it's when we talk about adulteration, it's really fentanyl in the opioid supply. It's to a lesser extent cocaine, and to a much lesser extent methamphetamine and ketamine. I just wanted to put in a quick note about novel benzodiazepines. Some of you may be or may have been hearing about bromazepam for many years now. We are starting to sort of see this shift as bromazepam starts to decline in positivity. We're seeing this upward tick in phenazelam. So phenazelam is the name that we call it. Online, it's being sold as clobromazelam. So it's kind of got that similar name, which probably is a reason for its use as a replacement. But I just wanted to give a heads up that if you are used to seeing bromazepam or talking about bromazepam, there have been some changes among that drug supply, and that will likely continue. These are the synthetic opioids. In the interest of time, I won't go through it in too much detail, but you can see that carfentanil we've seen now really for the last year as being something kind of that we see steadily as the Q3 numbers get finalized. I'm sure this number will, or this bar will go up. So carfentanil is something we're kind of seeing commonly at a just a steady rate, not kind of seeing any increases or decreases in positivity. On the other hand, parafluorofentanil and orthomethylfentanyl, we have seen actually quite big declines in their positivity. Interestingly, I've heard from folks up in Canada, and they're actually seeing more parafluorofentanil now than fentanyl. So that's something that we're keeping an eye on as drug trends change in Canada. We're interested in kind of how that will change here in the United States. With nitazines, we've always seen, as you can see by this graphic, kind of up and down swings of nitazines. Again, this bar for nitazines will go up for Q3. I'm not sure how high. But as Traci mentioned, we do continue to see the nitazines, and kind of what the future of the nitazines look like is still quite uncertain. A lot of it does seem like more of the cases of nitazines we see now are kind of similar to carfentanil in that they're small amounts alongside fentanyl. That's not always the case. Certainly, we can see carfentanil and the nitazines by themselves, but it does seem like a lot of the samples with nitazines do come alongside fentanyl. If you're familiar with the cathinones, this is just a graphic again. This is from DEA's NIFLS. I thought it was just an interesting graphic because it goes back so far, and quite an interesting graphic that also sheds light on drug scheduling, or at least precursor scheduling. So this big hump up here is MDMA. PMK, the precursor to MDMA, was scheduled in 2010, and you can see that now has launched this roller coaster of cathinones. First methylone, then I think butylone, or ethylone, then N-ethylpentylone, then utylone, now dimethylpentylone, and we've kind of been going through this roller coaster of cathinones that are being seen either alongside MDMA or mixed in with MDMA, or in ecstasy or Molly capsules. So quick note on some regional differences. This is a graphic. So the top bit is the Northeast, the middle bit is the Midwest, and then the bottom is the West Coast. One thing you can already note is that the bars on the West Coast are very small. We really don't see a lot alongside fentanyl on the West Coast, and you can see we do see a lot of differences in the Northeast. So I'll go through a couple. BTMPS, as I mentioned, BTMPS has been seen in really all regions of the country. And I apologize, my dog is barking. Just give me 1 second. Next, we go to diphenhydramine. Diphenhydramine is something that we see almost exclusively in the Midwest. Lidocaine, again, something that we see kind of across all different regions. Medetomidine, we don't really see much medetomidine, and same with xylazine as we get there on the West Coast. See a lot more of it in the Northeast and the Midwest. Procaine, interestingly, we've seen a lot of procaine from the Northeast, so Traci's familiar with some of those identifications. Quinine, again, quinine is something that we see almost exclusively in the Midwest. Tetracaine, again, something that we're seeing more commonly in the Northeast, and then again over to xylazine, where we don't see much on the West Coast, but we see a bunch in the Midwest and Northeast. So this is my last slide on purity. I probably don't have time to go through and show this, but I just want to just make a note about sort of the potency testing or the purity testing that we do of drugs. So we do not only qualitative testing, but quantitative testing. I'm going to come back to fentanyl in a moment, but actually, let me just equate you with get you familiar with the graphic. The back gray is the maximum amount of a substance that we've seen in purity. You can see cocaine and meth, they do get up to 100% or pretty much nearly 100% pure. The bars then, the left bar is the mean, and the right bar is the median, and then I did put the standard deviations on the bars. So you'll notice that the standard deviations are pretty large. That's been common since we started doing our quantitative testing. There's a lot of variability in products from one to another. There's pretty much no consistency when we do our quantitative testing. So that's why sometimes we like to look at mean and median. But for methamphetamine, you can see, as you probably know, a lot of the data that other agencies produce shows that methamphetamine is pretty pure in the United States. Maybe not as pure as some may hope. It's not always 100% pure. There is some differences there. Some of this also is just differences probably in region that we don't break this out by. And then cocaine, interestingly, we have been seeing increasing purity of cocaine. That could be due, we don't break this out, crack versus coke. That could just be due to some different sample types, but you can see in the last few quarters we have been seeing an increase in cocaine. Now back to fentanyl. So with fentanyl for us has always, on average, kind of been around the 10 to 15% average range. Towards the end of 2024, we were starting to see sort of a fall off in that, down to about 8% on average, I think, is where this number shakes out. I know that a lot of folks have been hearing about decreases in fentanyl purity. We're actually just not seeing that right now in our data. That just could be our data is not as representative of other sources. We haven't been able to test as many samples due to a lot of the variability this year. We haven't been able to test as many samples in Q2 and Q3 as we have previously, but we're getting back on track with a new quantitative method here in Q3, moving forward into Q4. So it'll be interesting to see how that data aligns. But you can see of the samples that we've tested, we really are still sticking around that kind of 10 to 15% on average of samples that we test. And again, that's an aggregate across the country. The average purity on the West Coast is actually higher than it is here on the East Coast. So there is some variability in that plays into those numbers. Thank you for listening. Hopefully I left good enough time for questions. Happy to turn it over to Zoe.
Yeah. Um, thank
Did
you
we
so
lose Tracy?
I think Tracy's still here. She just turned her video off.
Oh, okay.
Uh, so with everything you just presented, I see there was a question earlier about like how to put this information into action. So, obviously it's really helpful for police and what you shared, but and some of what Tracy shared was kind of putting it into action. But how would you suggest folks put this information into action?
Sure. Yeah, definitely welcome Tracy's perspective as well on this. I would say that from what we know and from how variable the results that we are get, I mean, it really has to be you really have to take your own location into account. If we were to take data from Philadelphia and try to make policy or sort of just general statements about the drug supply, we would be wildly off. I mean, what's happening in Philadelphia with alpha 2 agonists is not the same as what's happening elsewhere. If we tried to educate people about how much metatomin is in the supply as it is in Philadelphia, for example, on the West Coast, it just wouldn't resonate. And kind of vice versa. They do see, for whatever reason, more BTMPS on the West Coast than we do. It seems right now, at least on the East Coast. So, I mean, I think step one is really understanding where you are and having the right data for the sort of jurisdiction and the population that you're talking to. And then just understanding that there is a lot of variability. We've done some work here in Philadelphia where we try to kind of anonymously, if you will, track products over time. And we see just spikes in products. We've seen, for example, we had a product that we tracked that was tracking about 10% fentanyl, and I forget what it was, like 20% xylazine, and then we noticed what appeared like a cutting event where your xylazine jumped to 60% and your fentanyl fell off a bit. So I mean, you have to always be aware that that's going to happen. I think to make any general statements about, oh, all of our opioid supply is 10% fentanyl would just not be accurate because there is so much variability between product and product. So I think it's understanding what your region looks like and then understanding really how variable and how dynamic the supply is to not try and make any concrete um, recommendations because tomorrow could be different than today.
So Tracy, my question was, with an action-based audience of law enforcement, what are some of the actionable or the ways you would take the information you shared and make it actionable?
Well, I think that if you didn't have a drug checking program in your community to really work to support the growth of that, and I think we've kind of been talking a lot about different ways to do that, but a drug checking program that is community connected is not just more valid and good science, but it is also part of the community connection that is really important to have as for police. So that would be first and foremost, and these data and the kinds of data that you're seeing are only because we have that kind of really privileged partnership. The second thing I think would be to really focus in on the things that we're being asked to do when you get a 911 call, or equip staff with, and that is to make sure that naloxone is available and used appropriately. But other things like sedation preparation and wound preparation for the community is in place too. So those are a couple of big things. And then clearly, like, just connecting with other people about this, because it is really local, and your region, you may have regional operations and supports that could benefit from learning about emerging trends like this, and what really is in your background, in your backyard, as opposed to somewhere else. We want to not cause concern too when there isn't one. The more information and intelligence that can be shared that's accurate and actionable, like it's a pill form, or it's a color of a certain thing, or that it tastes like a certain thing, is helpful for avoiding and for people to manage their risk, but also for thinking about preparing healthcare providers and others in the field. So
Yeah, and it's almost as if, oh no, sorry, you go, Dr. Alex.
I was just going to add one thing. Agree 100% with Tracy in terms of the sort of basic things that we've come used to, like access to naloxone, clear breathing, clear airways for breathing. Those things are really important. I just wanted to mention for naloxone, only because we get this question a lot. I've tracked countless numbers of synthetic opioids that are far more potent than fentanyl, things like carfentanil. And there really is no such thing as a sort of naloxone resistant opioid. Naloxone is still extremely effective in these cases. The question usually becomes whether or not 2 milligrams of naloxone is enough, or it needs to be 4 milligrams. As Tracy mentioned, you get too high in that. I mean, getting to 8 milligrams is likely never necessary, but in some cases, depending on the circumstances, could be. I can't always say it never would be, but naloxone is highly effective. So the one thing is the dosing, and then the redosing, understanding that somebody in an hour or two may need another dose of naloxone, and that's what's being usually managed more in a clinical setting. But I think a lot of this, a lot of what you'll hear about naloxone resistance comes from the adulterants. And sure, they should be naloxone resistant. Alpha 2 agonists, local anesthetics, benzodiazepines aren't supposed to be reactive to naloxone. So you're still going to have that sedation there. You're still going to have some of those other adverse effects, but the person should be breathing. So just want everyone to know that naloxone is effective, and there's really not an opioid. There isn't an opioid that I've ever come across that is naloxone resistant.
We do have one question in the Q&A. It says, to Alex, would you say drug checking numbers are comparable to the numbers of those who are using these substances? Are the trends you're seeing equivalent to how much use is going on?
I personally, I'll let Tracy, I'm actually going to kick this over to Tracy. I will say personally that I think that the trends are more correlatable to the concern about certain supplies. Because people have an interest in getting drugs. So everybody has a different interest in why they want their drugs to be checked. And Tracy can talk more about that. But so I don't think that there's any correlation between the number of samples we have and use, like the amount of use or use patterns or things. I do, though, think that the reason we have more fentanyl is because there's more concern about fentanyl in the opioid supply. But Tracy, I'll throw the rest of that over to you.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think also it's hard when people don't really know what it is. They may be given something or find something, or have a different supplier who it looks different than what they had before. So the reflection of what people are using and sort of the results from drug checking and the laboratory work is sometimes wildly different, right? You saw for instance, in the cocaine, for Q2, 11% contained fentanyl, and Q3, 14% contained fentanyl. These are unexpected additions unless you're looking to create a speedball. Well, we know from behavioral studies with people who use drugs that most people want to make their own speedball. So coming in with drugs that are being checked, you're not like, here's my speedball. How does it look to you? You're making it yourself. So there's no rationale for it. So it would be afterwards they had a bad reaction, but in this case a lot of times it's unexpected. In talking with people who are having a substance, they have a weird reaction or they're concerned about their source, and that's what it's more a reflection of. In some places that have regular access, like Massachusetts and Rhode Island, to drug checking, we do see people just doing this as part of their routine. They want to stay safe. So every, they buy on this day and the next day they always go and do their drug checking. It's part of their normal status of kind of their own quality control of their own health and safety to stay safe. So this is not necessarily a reflection of what everyone would do or what everyone had access to drug checking, but it certainly is a reflection of use that's happening. But the disconnect is great between what's in the drug supply and what people think they're getting in the drug supply still. We always thought that we knew, but we actually probably never completely have.
All right. Well, Dr. Alex, Dr. Traci, you guys have been so helpful and so informative today. Thank you so much for joining us. Everybody who's watching in their offices, at home, or wherever you are, thank you so much for joining us. We will be sending out the slides. We'll have video links and a survey. We invite you to please tell us what you thought today. And again, thank you guys so much for spending your afternoon with us. Have a great day.